for the hardest-hitting show in talk radio. The true progressive voice since 2012. This is Southpaws.
And welcome to Southpaws on the Pacifica Radio Network. We are the leaders of the revolution. I'm Darren Gibson. We have to talk about what happened in Brazil over the weekend as they experienced their own version of January 6th. Coincidence? I don't think so. I think it smells like Steve Bannon and Donald Trump. And speaking of, we have to talk about classified documents, but this time not with Trump, but with President Biden, who was vice president at the time. We also have to talk about a West Virginia journalist who was fired from her job. Dr. Dre hits Marjorie Taylor Greene with a cease and desist. And we're going to hit 2 Hammer Time winners this week, and we've got plenty more. But before we get started with today's show, a couple of reminders. You can follow us on social media by going to facebook.com/Southpaws Radio Show. You can follow us on Tumblr at southpawsradioshow.tumblr.com. You can follow us on YouTube by doing a search for Southpaws Radio. You can follow us on Mastodon by doing a search for Southpaws Radio there. And you can become a patron of the show by going to patreon.com/Southpaws Radio. You can listen to the show anytime at Apple Podcasts, Spreaker, Stitcher, Google Podcasts, Podcast Addict, Podvine, and Pandora by doing a search for Southpaws. And once you found our logo, you found us. We send links to our weekly episodes to our Facebook, Tumblr, YouTube, and Mastodon accounts. You can listen to us on Global Community Radio Channel 1 every Saturday night at 11 Eastern, and you can listen to us on great Pacifica stations including KCEI in Taos, New Mexico, KZGM in Kabul, Missouri, and KEPJ in San Antonio, Texas. So be sure to listen to us there. We also want to give a shout-out to WGRN, Columbus, Ohio, for downloading last week's episode. We hope you join the Southpaws family. We are recording this show on Thursday, January 12th, 2023, and I want to start out with what happened in Brazil over the weekend. I have this story. This is Carla Britti and Natalia Scaraboto writing for the Associated Press. This is dated January 11th out of Brasilia. Brazil's capital prepared for the possibility of more violent demonstrations Wednesday by people seeking to overturn the presidential election, with local security officials blocking access to buildings trashed 4 days earlier by a horde of rioters. A flyer promoting a mega protest to retake power circulated on social media platforms, particularly Telegram, and urged protesters to turn out in 24 cities, including the capital. It was unclear how large or violent such demonstrations might shape up to be, but skittish authorities took no chances. Speaking to journalists in Brasilia, the federal appointee who has assumed control of the capital's security said police were shutting down the main avenue to traffic and limiting pedestrian access with barricades. They are blocking all access to the square that was the site of Sunday's mayhem. That is according to the official Ricardo Capelli. He said a small area on the avenue has been reserved for peaceful demonstrations but will be surrounded by police and the National Guard, and all protesters searched upon entry. Capelli said, quote, "The right to protest freely will always be respected and cannot be confused with terrorism," end of quote. Citing the call to action on social media, a Supreme Court justice ordered local authorities in cities across Brazil to prevent protesters from blocking roads or occupying public spaces and buildings. Justice Alexander de Moraes also ordered arrests and fines for people and companies who participate or help with logistics and funding. Good. That's what needs to happen. And that's what should have happened here in this country on January 6th of 2021. The nation remains on edge after supporters of former President Jair Bolsonaro rampaged through Congress, the Supreme Court, and the presidential palace on Sunday, laying ruin to the government's three most important buildings. Officials arrested or detained some 1,500 people by the following morning, hundreds of whom were sent to prison. Though there is no evidence of fraud in the October 30th presidential election, the protesters have claimed the true winner was far-right Bolsonaro. He has fired up his base about the vulnerability of electronic voting machines despite independent experts' assurances they are closely scrutinized. Bolsonaro has also warned his supporters that the election's leftist victor, Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva, would impose communism. God, this is right out of the Donald Trump playbook. It really is. And you know why? Because that's who is the architect of all this. Donald Trump, Steve Bannon. You know where Bolsonaro is right now? You know where he was on Sunday? He was at Mar-A-Lago. It's the truth, folks. He's in this country. They're talking about extraditing him. But now he's saying that he's got medical issues. Oh, I have a medical problem. You can't send me back there. Yeah, you'll be hearing a lot of that today. I guarantee it. Continuing the story, the fresh call for an uprising Wednesday sparked concern that the crackdown hadn't dampened the will of radicals. Among those who vow to continue struggling is 35-year-old Daniel Bresson, who traveled some 300 miles from the interior of Parana State to join Sunday's protest in Brasilia. He was detained by police the next morning, though he denies participating in any of the vandalism. Bresson said by phone from the federal police's temporary holding center, quote, "A lot of people are going to be afraid to go to the streets and be arrested. I myself fear persecution by the legal system, but I'm not going to stop fighting and I'm not going to get discouraged. I'm ready for everything. Our freedom is worth more than our lives." End of quote. Jailing rioters represent only part of the government's effort to hold people responsible, with authorities also seeking to track down those who enabled the uprising. That includes organizers who summoned protesters to the Capitol and paid their way, as well as local security personnel accused of either standing by and allowing the destruction to occur or even cooperating. Justice Minister Flavio Dino told local press this week that authorities have identified some of the protest financiers. He said they are based in the South and Center-West regions that Bolsonaro carried in the election. Without identifying individuals, he said they are members of the agribusiness sector, local business owners, and people registered to own firearms. Dino previously said the riot was apparently intended to spark a domino effect around the country. He has referred to the encampments that have been set up by Bolsonaro supporters outside military buildings to call on the armed forces to overturn election results as, quote, incubators of terrorists, end of quote. Authorities cleared away the camps in Brasilia and other cities after the rioting, which, good on them. They needed to do that. In November, the Supreme Court froze 43 bank accounts of people accused of having financed roadblocks that disrupted highway traffic in the wake of Lula's victory. At least 30 were in the center-west state of Mato Grosso, Brazil's top soybean producer. De Moraes, the Supreme Court justice, also ordered preventative detention for the men who were serving Sunday as head of the federal district's security and military police chief, as well as searches of their residences. Both men have been fired since the rioting. In his decision, which was made public late Tuesday, De Moraes wrote, quote, "Absolutely nothing justifies the omission and collusion of the security secretary and the military police commander," end of quote. By the way, he's got the word nothing in all capital letters. The justice also denounced the protest encampment sponsored by diverse financiers. De Moraes wrote, quote, "There are strong indications that the conduct of criminal terrorists could only have occurred with the willful participation or omission, which will be determined in these investigations, of the aforementioned public authorities," end of quote. The fired security secretary, Anderson Torres, had been Bolsonaro's justice minister. Capelli, the federal appointee who now controls the secretariat, said Wednesday that Torres assumed his new position, immediately fired subordinates, and then traveled to Florida. So he's right there alongside his boss. Capelli previously told local media there were signs Torres' actions amounted to intentional sabotage of security ahead of Sunday's violence. Torres said Tuesday night on Twitter that he was interrupting his vacation and returning to Brazil to present his defense. He said ethics and legality had always governed his actions. Yeah, whose government and whose ethics? Really? I'm telling you what, it's the truth. Bolsonaro, and apparently this aide of his, were in Mar-A-Lago at the time that this riot happened. Let's just call it a traitorous riot, just like the maggots did on January 6, 2021 in Washington, D.C. These people are traitors, and they should be prosecuted as traitors. And if they get convicted, there's one penalty, and only one, and that's execution. And I mean every single word of what I am saying. You're not going to reform these people. You're not going to do it. There's no such thing as reform. They've proved this over and over again. I'll tell you what. I'll tell a story. I was at a diner today in West Michigan. I'm not going to say what city or what diner it was, but it was in a very conservative rural area. And I heard some old white guy, gee, could have guessed that, right? Bitching and complaining and whining and crying about Biden. Oh, Biden's a hypocrite. He's had documents. They go after Trump. Oh, then what really took the cake was that he started in, oh, you ought to hear about who's now on board for reparations for the blacks. Yeah. This racist motherfucker. It took everything within my power to not say a word. I just wanted to listen because that's good fodder for this show. Oh boy, don't catch me on a bad day. It'll be ugly for you, not for me. Just warning you. So I want to get to our next story here. This is Carol E. Lee and Ken Delanian writing for NBC News out of Washington. This is an update to a story that broke earlier in the week, originally reported by CBS News that there were classified documents found in an office used by Joe Biden after his vice presidency and before he became president. So this is an updated story as of January 11th, out of Washington. Aides to President Joe Biden have discovered at least one additional batch of classified documents in a location separate from the Washington office he used after leaving the Obama administration. That is according to a person familiar with the matter. Since November, after the discovery of documents with classified markings in his former office, Biden aides have been searching for any additional classified materials that might be in other locations he used. That is, according to the source who spoke on the condition of anonymity to provide details about the ongoing inquiry. The White House did not reply to a request for comment. The Justice Department had no comment up until Thursday, January 12th, when Attorney General Merrick Garland said that he was ordering a special counsel to look into the matter. So now we've got two special counsels going on, one for Trump and his documents and one for Biden and his documents. And we'll talk about the difference between the two, because there is a huge difference. Let's continue the story first. The initial discovery of classified documents in an office used by Biden after his vice presidency was first reported on Monday by CBS News. The classification level, number, and precise location of the additional documents was not immediately clear, and they now have said that those documents were found in Biden's garage at his residence in Delaware. It was also not immediately clear when the additional documents were discovered and if the search for any other classified materials Biden may have from the Obama administration is complete. Well, as a matter of fact, Merrick Garland, in announcing the special counsel, gave the timeline of when documents were found and where they were found. So if you go back to his press conference, you'll have all that information. Biden aides have been sifting through documents stored at locations beyond his former Washington office to determine if there are other classified documents that need to be turned over to the National Archives and reviewed by the Justice Department. Again, that is according to the source familiar with the matter. The search was described as exhaustive, with the goal of getting a full accounting of all classified documents that may have inadvertently been packed in boxes when Biden cleared out of the vice president's office space in January 2017. Senator Josh Hawley, Republican of Missouri, reacted on social media minutes after the NBC News report on the new documents, tweeting out the words, "Special Counsel." Well, Merrick Garland issued a special counsel on this. The White House on Monday issued a statement confirming that a small number of documents with classified markings that appeared to be from the Obama administration had been found at a Washington think tank tied to Biden on November 2nd. The documents were discovered in a locked closet by Biden's attorneys while they prepared to vacate office space at the Penn Biden Center for Diplomacy and Global Engagement. That is according to a statement issued Monday by Richard Sauber, special counsel to the president. The University of Pennsylvania had leased a suite of offices for the center in February 2018, including one for then private citizen Biden's personal use when he was in Washington. Biden told reporters Tuesday that he was surprised by the discovery and that he didn't know what was in the documents. The chair and vice chair of the Senate Intelligence Committee have written to Director of National Intelligence Avril Haines asking for access to the classified documents, a damage assessment by the intelligence community, and a briefing on both the Biden and Trump documents. That's according to 3 congressional staffers. This request is similar to how the committee requested information after the raid at Mar-A-Lago, Donald Trump's resort in Florida. Sauber said Biden's lawyers immediately reached out to the National Archives about the find, and the agency took control of the documents the next day. 2 sources familiar with the matter said less than a dozen documents with classified markings were found at the office. The archives referred the matter to the Justice Department. U.S. Attorney General Merrick Garland had asked John Lausch, U.S. Attorney for the Northern District of Illinois and a holdover Trump appointee, to review how the classified material ended up in the closet. That is according to a source familiar with the matter telling NBC News. By the way, in the press conference on Thursday, Garland said that he wanted Lausch to be the special counsel. Lausch turned it down because he is leaving the Justice Department to take a job in the private sector. Therefore, another appointee was chosen. Biden said Tuesday, quote, "We're cooperating fully," end of quote. Trump's possession of over 100 documents with classified markings, despite having been subpoenaed for their return, is the subject of a federal criminal investigation by the Justice Department. Trump has repeatedly mocked Biden over the find on his Truth Social account, while suggesting he'd been unfairly targeted by federal investigators despite the very different fact sets between his and Biden's cases. He wrote, quote, "A giant scam," end of quote. Yeah, he typed that as he looked in the mirror, because that's what he is, a big orange scam. Bradley Moss, a lawyer who specializes in national security issues and a frequent Trump critic, tweeted after the NBC report, quote, "Nothing I have seen has changed my mind yet that Biden and his team, for now at least, are not at risk of criminal exposure. Nor do I have any reason to believe this changes the calculus on an indictment of Trump. That said, this sloppiness by Biden's staff angers me," end of quote. And it should. It should anger everybody. You know, we expect these documents to be secure, yet they aren't. Somehow, Biden had them in his office in Washington. He's had some in his garage at his personal residence in Delaware. But here's the big difference. Donald Trump refused to hand over the documents, hid the documents, threw up legal roadblocks, and finally had to have his home in Mar-A-Lago raided by the FBI and U.S. Marshals and what other agencies were involved in it. That's the difference. Trump wanted to keep the documents. Biden, once they were discovered, were immediately turned over. There is your difference. It's not the same thing. It's not an apples and apples comparison. It's an apples and road apples comparison. And you can bet who has the road apples. It's Donald Trump. They're orange road apples. So for those of you conservatives who want to start in on Biden, oh, he needs to be prosecuted, you can stick it. Because guess what? I said it years ago, and it bears repeating now. And as critical as I am of Democrats, I have always said Democrats prosecute their own criminals. Republicans coddle their own criminals. George Santos being the newest one. I'm not calling him a criminal. He hasn't gone to trial for anything. He is under investigation for lying his ass off about pretty much everything. Right now, I want to get to this very disturbing story out of Charleston, West Virginia. This is Leah Willingham writing for the Associated Press. This is dated January 7th. Now, you want to get me angry. This really pisses me off. Take a listen to this, folks. A West Virginia journalist lost her job last month after she reported about alleged abuse of people with disabilities within the state agency that runs West Virginia's foster care and psychiatric facilities. Amelia Farrell Nisley, a reporter at West Virginia Public Broadcasting, said she was told to stop reporting on the Department of Health and Human Resources after leaders of the embattled agency threatened to discredit the publicly funded television and radio network. She later learned that her part-time job was being eliminated. In a statement, Nisley said that her news director told her the order came from WVPB Executive Director Butch Antolini, who was former communications director for Republican Governor Jim Justice. Antolini has served as executive director since 2021, when his predecessor was ousted after Justice overhauled the agency's governing board. Yeah, Republicans want to dismantle the media, especially anything that's public media. They want to dismantle NPR. They want to dismantle PBS. It's been that way for over 50 years. There's footage from the late 60s, early 70s of Fred Rogers, Mr. Rogers, going to Washington and testifying in front of Congress because Nixon wanted to cut funding for the Corporation for Public Broadcasting. Republicans want to silence media every single time. Period. End of story. Let me continue here. Justice has tried unsuccessfully to eliminate state funding for WVPB in the past and was accused of appointing partisan operatives to the board. WVPB receives around $4 million a year in state funding, and that's probably most of their budget. You want the honest truth. Antolini declined to comment, but other officials denied any effort to influence coverage. Yeah. West Virginia Educational Broadcasting Authority Chairman William H. File III said Antolini told the board, quote, he was not coerced or pressured by anyone, end of quote. File said in a statement that Nisley was never fired and remains on the WVPB payroll, though she said her door key and her email were deactivated. You know what? I can sympathize with her because I went through this when I was running WP in Kentwood, which was at the time a Pacifica affiliate. I found out that I was getting fired when my door key wouldn't work. Nobody there had the balls to come to my face and tell me that I was getting fired. They revoked my door key. Then the boss came down and talked to me and watched me clear out the office. So there you go. when you treat good people like shit, you're going to have bad karma coming your way, and you deserve every ounce of it. You can ask my former bosses. Let's see. Bob Goodrich went bankrupt, went to prison, and I didn't have to lift a finger to do anything. Let me go ahead and continue here. Knisely's departure comes during a tumultuous time for West Virginia media. Days before she was fired from WVPB, 3 reporters for the Pulitzer Prize-winning Charleston Gazette-Mail said they were fired after publicly criticizing an editorial decision by their company president, Doug Scaff, who, by the way, is the minority leader in the State House of Delegates. Scaff approved and led a video interview with Don Blankenship, a coal company executive convicted of safety violations connected to one of the worst coal mining disasters in recent U.S. history. Yeah, we've talked about Don Blankenship on this show. Just go back into our archives. The departures leave a diminished Capitol press corps to cover the upcoming legislative session, which begins January the 11th. Knisely's stories detailed alleged mistreatment of people with disabilities under state care. The department cares for some of the most vulnerable residents in one of the poorest U.S. states. After Knisely's departure from WVPB was first reported by the Parkersburg News and Sentinel last week, both Republican Senate President Craig Blair and Democratic Party Chair Mike Pushkin called the circumstances around her departure disturbing. Pushkin said Knisely's coverage of the glaring issues at DHHR was, quote, detailed, in-depth, and most importantly, true, end of quote. Blair wrote on Twitter December 29th, quote, there's a very clear difference between not liking what the media reports and actively working to silence them, end of quote. Knisely was hired as a part-time reporter at WVPB in September. In November, she was copied on an email from then DHHR Secretary Bill Crouch alleging inaccuracies in a story and asking for a complete retraction. That never happened, but in early December, Knisely said she was told by WVPB News Director Eric Douglas that she could no longer cover DHHR because of threats by state officials to discredit WVPB. A week later, amid mounting criticism, Crouch announced he was resigning. Douglas confirmed to the Associated Press that he was instructed to tell Knisely she would no longer be reporting on DHHR and that Antolini directed him to do so. As for threats from DHHR officials about discrediting WVPB, he said, quote, I'd rather not comment on that, end of quote. Yeah, because he's probably afraid he's going to be the next one on the chopping block. On December 15th, Knisely filed a human resources complaint about interference with her reporting. Things came to a head later that day over Knisely's press credentials for the 2023 legislative session. That is according to emails obtained by the Associated Press and first reported by the Parkersburg News and Sentinel. Douglas initially informed legislative staffers that Knisely would serve a vital role in WVPB's 2023 legislative coverage, but then the station's chief operating officer left him off an email saying she wouldn't need credentials after all. That troubled Senate spokesperson Jackie Bland, who emailed Douglas to ask about it. She wrote, quote, it feels kind of gross and shady to me that someone else would dip in and say that one of your reporters won't have any assignments related to the session, end of quote. She added, quote, I definitely wanted you to be aware that Butch and pals were trying to stick their fingers in the pie, end of quote. Responding the next day, Douglas said he had been pulled into Antolini's office and told, quote, things had changed with Amelia, end of quote. He didn't appreciate WVPB leadership going behind his back, quote, but for now, it is out of my hands. And you're right, it does feel gross and shady, end of quote. Knisely said she was informed December 20th that part-time positions were being eliminated. Her email and keycard were deactivated around that time. This week, Knisely announced on Twitter she was hired by the Beckley-based newspaper The Register Herald to report on West Virginia's upcoming legislative session. Her coverage will include developments with the State Department of Health and Human Resources. That's great news that she's got a job. Well, I have some advice for Amelia. You're in Beckley. I have the lawyer for you to talk to because you were fired for retaliation for filing that human resources complaint. So here's my advice. Give a call to Stephen P. New. Stephen P. New is a very famous lawyer in West Virginia. He gets things done. So, Amelia, if you're listening to this podcast, make sure you give Stephen a call, and I'll give him a free plug. 888-692-8084, newlawoffice.com. Give him a call, because he'll set him straight, and they won't like it. They already hate him in West Virginia in the government, because he's found a whole bunch of crooked stuff that he's uncovered. Hey, this will just be another feather in his hat. Speaking of legal issues, I have this story. This is published at the God account at dailydot.com. This is dated January 10th. Dr. Dre is the latest artist to take issue with a right-wing extremist using his music without his permission, with Marjorie Taylor Greene as the culprit. On Monday, the Republican, no, she is a cuckoo, clawed for attention with a ridiculous video of her walking through the halls of Congress in slow motion, taking a phone call from DT and snapping a selfie with Kevin McCarthy, all seemingly in celebration of helping get her fellow representative elected Speaker of the House. Yeah, it finally took 15 tries, but they finally weakened, at least the QQ caucus did. And now Kevin McCarthy, Speaker of the House, and they've already started by pushing 2 anti-abortion bills in Congress. Yeah, that's what they're going to focus on, folks. It's unbelievable. Well, it's not unbelievable, because I knew it. I called it. I knew it was going to happen. Go back into the archives. It's unreal. Let me continue the story. Why someone would want to celebrate 14 failed votes and numerous concessions to make that happen is unknown. But Marjorie Taylor Greene did just that, all to Dr. Dre's song, Still Dre. Well, there was the big joke going around that it was going to take Kevin McCarthy more times to get voted in than it took Lauren Boebert to pass the GED. Like I said, they want to be stupid, willfully ignorant. And they want everybody else to be just as dumb as they are. That's why they call it free dumb. Free to be dumb, as Jack Prince has said on this show. Going back to the story, the only thing is, Greene allegedly didn't have permission to use the song, which would likely require special licensing for use in a video. And Dr. Dre flat out shut her down. He told TMZ, quote, "I don't license my music to politicians, especially someone as divisive and hateful as this one," end of quote. The video was removed from Greene's social accounts, quote, "in response to a report from the copyright holder," end of quote, as of Monday afternoon, although it is currently still viewable on TMZ. Apparently eager to rewrite the narrative, Marjorie Taylor Greene then fired back at Dr. Dre with a bizarre claim that she, quote, "would never play your words of violence against women and police officers and your glorification of the thug life and drugs," end of quote. They got you on video! Video that you shot yourself! Nuttier than an entire fruitcake factory. They all are. All of you maggots are nutty, and you need to be locked up in a psych ward permanently. As novel as it is for someone who joked she would have won the January 6th insurrection to have anything to say regarding violence against police officers, it's also annoying that Republicans have become so accustomed to boldly denying the truth that Greene would feel confident enough to contradict something she literally just did and that everyone on Twitter saw. They're delusional. Absolutely beyond delusional. It's unreal. Speaking of unreal, let's go to our next segment.
Stop! Hammer time!
Oh yeah, it's hammer time. It is time to drop the hammer on the douchebag of the week. We've got 2 winners for you this week. So anytime that we have 2 winners, we let Wade Garrett chime in.
A double douche.
Who is that guy? Gentlemen, Wade Garrett. Holy sh**.
Exactly right.
All right. Wade Garrett serves up winner number 1. Yes, I have to do it. I have to criticize a quote-unquote Democrat. Winner number 1 this week, Michigan Supreme Court Justice Richard Bernstein. Oh boy, where do I begin with this one? Let's go to Matthew Miller, writing for MLive. This is dated January 5th. Listen to this, folks. Newly appointed Michigan Supreme Court Justice Kyra Harris Bolden hired a former convict as a law clerk. Pete Martell robbed a convenience store in Genesee County nearly 3 decades ago and, quote, had a bit of a shootout with the police, end of quote, as he put it in a 2017 interview. For that crime, he spent 14 years in prison. He also went on to earn a law degree, found a job with the State Appellate Defender Office, and enrolled in a doctoral program at the University of Michigan. But hours after the Detroit News reported on Martell's hiring and quoted Justice Richard Bernstein, a fellow Democratic nominee who campaigned with Bolden, saying he was completely disgusted by her decision, Martell resigned. Yeah, leave it to the Detroit News, that conservative piece of shit, to report on this. Because of course they would. They're a bunch of conservative nut jobs as well, even though they're published by the same company that publishes the more left-leaning Detroit Free Press. Doesn't matter. In a statement, Bolden said, quote, I have accepted Pete Martell's resignation. He did not want to be a distraction or in any way divert the court from his important work. I respect his decision and do not intend to comment further. End of quote. Bolden joined the court last week. She ran unsuccessfully for an open seat last year, losing narrowly to Justice Brian Zara, but was then appointed by Governor Gretchen Whitmer to fill the seat vacated by retiring Justice Bridget McCormick. Bernstein acknowledged that it's unusual for sitting justices, particularly those nominated by the same party, to criticize one another's decisions in public, but said in an interview with MLive that he felt Bolden's decision would reflect poorly on the entire court. Quote, whether this is perceived or real, is it fair to the police and to the prosecutors that one of the critical people that's going to be playing a role in that decision, in this situation, the clerk, was involved in a shootout with police? End of quote. Bernstein said he doesn't see this as a question of redemption, of whether criminals can be welcomed back into society, but of whether someone who had committed a serious crime could serve in an important advisory role in the state's highest court. Bernstein said, quote, I wish him the absolute best in his new endeavors, and I think that ultimately he's going to make a huge difference wherever he goes. End of quote. Martell did not respond to an interview request. He said during an interview for the Michigan Department of Corrections Field Days podcast that at the time of the robbery, quote, I was just kind of wandering around in life, had graduated high school and didn't know what to do after that and felt like I wanted to be a gangster. I had a couple of friends that we got into stealing things and stealing cars and eventually got into armed robberies, and I ended up going to prison for an armed robbery. End of quote. After an unsuccessful escape attempt and a lot of time in solitary confinement, he said, quote, I knew that I'd screwed up my life and I dug myself a really, really deep hole. So I felt like the best thing I could do at that point was to start reading all the stuff that I was supposed to have read back in high school. I knew that somewhere down the road I'd get another shot of college, and I wanted to make good on it when I did. End of quote. After his release, he went to community college, found work helping with a class action lawsuit led by the University of Michigan law professor Paul Reingold, was hired on to do prisoner rights work at the American Friends Service Committee, and went to law school at Wayne State University. On the Department of Corrections podcast, he said, quote, my prison experience is certainly great context for the work, and it certainly lit the fire for me to do that. End of quote. Well, we have an update to the story. This is the Associated Press writing January 9th out of Lansing. A Michigan Supreme Court justice apologized to a fellow justice Monday for harshly criticizing her hiring of an ex-convict to serve as a law clerk. Justice Richard Bernstein issued a statement saying he apologized to Justice Kyra Harris Bolden in person at the Hall of Justice and that she accepted his apology. He said, quote, "I regret overstepping Justice Bolden's hiring process and should not have disturbed her ability to lead her chambers," end of quote. Bolden had hired 48-year-old Pete Martell, who served 14 years in prison after robbing a Flint area store and shooting at police officers, according to a report published by the Detroit News. He was released in 2008, changed his life, and obtained a degree from Wayne State University Law School. Bernstein also apologized to Martell. He said, quote, "Mr. Martell is not an elected official, and my actions invited people into his life in a way that he had not signed up for, and he deserved more consideration," end of quote. Yeah, you're damn right. Bernstein's statement continued, quote, "I am committed to working with Justice Bolden in the coming years to advance our many shared values, including immediately working to expand opportunities in the legal field for those who have repaid their debts to society," end of quote. Bolden said last week that she accepted Martell's resignation after Bernstein's criticism. So that might be the end of it there, but this apology doesn't let him off the hook because of other things that he said in an interview to the Detroit News. And I want to get to this piece. This is an opinion piece that was written by Madiba Kenny, writing for the website Balls and Strikes. This is dated January 10th. Here's what she wrote. "The Michigan Supreme Court took an important step toward a more inclusive democracy last week and then promptly took 2 steps back. On New Year's Day, Justice Kyra Harris Bolden took her oath of office and became the first black woman ever to ascend to the state's highest court. Bolden was driven to law school by her family history. After her great-grandfather was lynched, his murderers were acquitted by an all-white jury. Bolden went on to serve as a criminal defense attorney and then in the state legislature. When Governor Gretchen Whitmer announced the appointment last year, she said that Bolden, as a black woman and the mother of a newborn, would, quote, bring a unique perspective to the court that has been too long left out, end of quote. But as it turns out, not all unique or long left out perspectives are welcome in the judiciary. One of Bolden's first acts on the bench was hiring a law clerk who spent much of his young adult years behind bars. 48-year-old Peter Martell was incarcerated in Michigan between 1994 and 2008 for robbing a Flint area convenience store and shooting at police officers while fleeing. Bolden's colleague on the bench, Justice Richard Bernstein, responded to news of Martell's hire with relentless public criticism, describing it as, quote, a slap in the face to every police officer in Michigan, end of quote. Privately, he gave Bolden the silent treatment, telling a local news outlet, quote, I'm no longer talking to her, we don't share the same values, end of quote. Peter ultimately resigned after just 1 day on the job. Bernstein's treatment of Martell exemplifies the court's treatment of criminalized people, indefinitely confining them to one side of the defendant's table and denigrating them as unqualified for full participation in the institutions of a democratic society. A legal system can't treat criminalized people and the communities they come from fairly while simultaneously excluding them as forever unfit for the administration of justice. Judges whose concept of policing has about as much nuance as Paw Patrol infect the legal system with bias in favor of incarceration and perpetual punishment. Peter Martell is, by all accounts, the paradigmatic example of the prisoner who turns his life around. Roughly 30 years ago, Martell robbed a convenience store and shot at a police officer in his efforts to escape. He pled guilty to armed robbery and assault with intent to do great bodily harm, and he spent 14 years in prison, a decade of which was spent in solitary confinement. While incarcerated, he began pursuing an education and helped other prisoners with their appeals. He kept working with people in prison after his release. He also completed an undergraduate degree, graduated from law school, passed the Michigan bar exam, and is pursuing a PhD at the University of Michigan, where his research focuses on the criminal legal system and whether juries are representative of the communities they're drawn from. At Michigan, Martell is a student of none other than former Michigan Supreme Court Chief Justice Bridget McCormick, whose vacated seat Bolden just filled. McCormick said of Peter and his short-lived work for the court, quote, "I honestly can't think of anything in a justice system that we value more. We should support people who succeed at redemption," end of quote. Bernstein argued that such support has limits. Hiring Peter was a step too far, he said, as, quote, "there are certain jobs you should never be allowed to have after you shoot at a police officer," end of quote. Bernstein described himself to local news as, quote, "intensely pro-law enforcement," end of quote, and added that he was completely disgusted by the notion that someone convicted of shooting at a police officer could be involved in making decisions in cases that may affect police officers. Let me stop there. Bernstein told a local news outlet that he is, quote, "intensely pro-law enforcement," end quote. Is this the justice you want to go in front of when you have a police brutality case? Richard Bernstein has a bias. He has a very bad bias. You know, I'm just going to say it. He is a blind justice. Literally, he is blind. Justice is supposed to be blind. But apparently, he can see no such thing as redemption for anybody. By his actions, by his words. I don't care that he apologized. It's hollow words. It means nothing. Let me continue here. For Bernstein, publicly scolding a colleague for employing a returned citizen was consistent with his role as a neutral arbiter. Bernstein said he fully supports second chances. He also said they're beside the point in this instance. Speaking to Michigan Public Radio, Bernstein asserted that the issue was not whether Martell is redeemed, but whether he is, quote, "an appropriate fit for this specific job, dealing with the issues that the court has to deal with, dealing with the people the court has to deal with," end of quote. Bernstein further maintained that Martell might be well suited to make a difference, quote, "in an advocacy role," end of quote, but that employees of the court, quote, "should not be advocates," end of quote. I disagree. They need to be advocates for justice. Period. That's what they're there for. The irony here is stunning. Bernstein chastised Bolden for making a political statement by hiring Martell without considering that his opposition to that hiring could have political meaning too. Bernstein said that Martell isn't an appropriate choice to work in the legal system because of his time on the wrong side of it. But Bernstein's intense support for cops and disgust with Martell's hiring are purportedly unbiased sentiments with no bearing on Bernstein's decisions in cases that will affect police officers and criminal defendants. This isn't a mere hypothetical. The Michigan Supreme Court will be hearing oral argument later this week to determine, among other things, whether police officers coerced a defendant to make a self-incriminating statement. If I were the defendant in that case, I wouldn't think I could count on the court to consider the possibility that the police weren't on their best behavior. On Monday, Bernstein issued a statement in which he apologized to Bolden and asserted a commitment to advancing their many shared values, including immediately working to expand opportunities in the legal field for those who have repaid their debts to society. It is unclear whether that commitment includes welcoming back Martell, who also received an apology from Bernstein in the statement, but only for the intrusions on his privacy, not for Bernstein's assertion that he is categorically unqualified to help judges apply the law. Bernstein's fawning reverence for the police should be no less evidence of bias than wearing an ACAB shirt to jury duty. He has no reservations about declaring it, however, because the American legal system conflates commitment to incarceration and punishment with objectivity and fairness. People like Bernstein label any perceived deviation from the pro-police mass incarceration and collateral consequences baseline as advocacy to be purged from the legal system. This enforcement of faux neutrality equates proper, sober judicial job performance with joining a fan club for the boys in blue. Limiting the permissible range of experiences has tangible impacts on jurisprudence. The overrepresentation of former prosecutors and corporate lawyers among both state and federal judges is inseparable from the state's criminalization of the poor and protection of capital. A 2022 report by the American Bar Association showed that 78% of federal judges are white, 70% are men. This homogeneity, too, has consequences. Mistaking judges' lack of perspective for lack of bias makes it easier for regular people to acquiesce to their judicial decisions and easier for the law to serve the interests of the powerful by default. Bernstein was correct about one thing. The issues arising from the hiring of Peter Martell go to the heart of what courts are supposed to do, but he was wrong about what that is. Courts are supposed to fulfill the promise of equal justice under law, not hold 30-year-old grudges on behalf of cops. Martell would have made the Michigan Supreme Court more just, and his lost opportunity is a loss for the people it is supposed to serve. Bravo. Absolutely bravo. Again, that piece is by Madiba Denny, writing for the website Balls and Strikes, and she is right on the money with that one. So, winner number one is pro-police justice Richard Bernstein. Winner number two, Representative Troy Nehls, Republican of Texas. We have the actual audio of this. He made a condescending, sexist comment to CNN's Aaron Burnett the other day on air when they were talking about the vote for Speaker of the House. This runs about 1:40. Folks, take a listen to what a Republican pig sounds like.
For 30 years, I can be here till July.
And are you, is that a metaphor for how you feel about this? Is your support for McCarthy, there's nothing that can break or shake it at this point?
Well, listen, I don't know if you're aware of, young lady, but I am also a member of the House Freedom Caucus.
Whoa, whoa, whoa. Young lady? Really? You're an asshole. Let me continue.
So I am one of those America First patriots. And I have said to my friends, my colleagues in the Freedom Caucus, that I don't believe that this is the battle we should be waging. I think the real battle starts when we start drafting legislation and policy in the 118th Congress under a Speaker McCarthy. And you have to understand, your viewers have to understand, there's 35 to 40 of us in the House Freedom Caucus. If we have a thin margin of 222 Republicans, it takes 218 of us to pass any legislation, right? The House Freedom Caucus is more relevant than ever. So I believe that is the battle. Those are the conversations that should take place, because Kevin McCarthy understands that in order for him to pass anything in this 118th Congress, he's going to need support and the endorsement from the House Freedom Caucus. And that's when I believe we should have these conversations.
So I'll assume when you called me a young lady, it was a compliment.
Of course it was. This is my first time on the Clinton News Network. Absolutely.
Okay, that I will say was a bit, in my opinion, rude, but I'm glad you're talking to me, and I will treat you with the respect that you deserve.
Sure.
Yeah, the respect that he deserves is no respect. I'll say it. Troy Nehls, you are a fucking asshole. Quote me on it. Quote me all day on it. I don't care. I tell you what, if I was Aaron Burnett, I would have cut the interview right off at the first condescending comment. I would have been like, drawing the finger right across the neck, like, cut him off. Unbelievable. Well, I shouldn't say unbelievable, because this is what Republicans are. They're sexist. They're racist. They're homophobes. They're transphobes. They only like old, rich, white people. I'll say it. That's all they give a goddamn about. And the sooner that the rest of you wake up to that fact, maybe something can be done about it. But in the meantime, to Richard Bernstein and to Troy Nehls, we have this message for you.
Don't be a douchebag.
Yeah, you got that right, especially to Nehls. What a condescending jerk. Unbelievable. Absolutely unbelievable. And before we get into our off-the-cuff segment, I want to mention that we're going to have a Southpaws Douchebag of the Year 2022. Throughout the course of the year, we featured 77 people, organizations, or businesses in our Hammer Time segment. I have selected a blue ribbon panel to go through those 77 winners of 2022, and they're going to narrow it down to the top 10. We're going to list the top 10, and you're going to get a chance to vote on it. We will have a list of top 10 available by January 27th. Voting will take place exclusively on our official Facebook page. So go to facebook.com/Southpaws Radio Show and vote for the top 3 in order. We'll have ranked choice voting. Again, the ballot will be available starting January 27th, only on our official Facebook page, facebook.com/Southpaws Radio Show. Be sure to get your vote in, and you can only vote once for Douchebag of the Year 2022 from Southpaws. And now let's get to our off-the-cuff segment for this week. I have this story. This is Mike Stunson writing for the Sacramento Bee. This is dated January 4th. I saw the pictures of this, and this is amazing. A 77-year-old man was rescued from a Pennsylvania car wash after his vehicle overturned. Firefighters were dispatched at 2:15 p.m. January 3rd to Wave Car Wash in Colmar when the driver became trapped in his car on its side. That is according to Hatfield Township Fire Marshal Mikkel Waldron. It's believed that the driver pressed his foot on the gas in the car wash, which caused the vehicle to overturn. The driver's leg was pinned in between the door and the car's body. Now, wait a minute here. Why did he have his car door open going through a car wash? That makes no sense. Waldron said the door was likely open and the man's leg was out of the car when the accident occurred. The driver was trapped in the vehicle for nearly 90 minutes as the firefighters used airbags, blocks, and jacks to slowly lift the vehicle out of the car wash. Local media reports the man was taken to a hospital for injuries to his leg. Wave Car Wash said that it is temporarily closed due to the mishap. In a Facebook post, they said, quote, "Fortunately, nobody was seriously injured, but unfortunately, several pieces of equipment were destroyed." End of quote. Colmar is about 30 miles north of Philadelphia. Yeah, I can't believe that he did this, but if he hit the gas, that would have done it. Unreal. When you go through the automatic car wash, you're supposed to put your car in neutral, take your foot off the brake, don't touch the gas, don't touch nothing. Just let the machinery do its thing. Well, folks, we're starting to run out of time. I will tell you that we're going to keep an eye on things involving the classified documents found at Joe Biden's house and at his office. So we'll stay on top of that. Plus, I'm sure by next week we'll have much more to talk about Ottawa Impact and the nut jobs running Ottawa County, Michigan. But right now, we need to wrap things up. We're out of time for this week. We'll be back next week. I'm Darren Gibson. Please support independent media, the First Amendment, and a woman's right to choose.
The stations that carry Southpaws do not necessarily share the opinions expressed on the show. Southpaws is protected by the First Amendment to the U.S. Constitution and is copyrighted by Big D Entertainment. All rights reserved.